At this point, we'll bring Scott and Marta back on we got about 20 minutes for a panel discussion, and there's been a couple questions that have been popping up in the chat box. And maybe Marta, will start with you to if you wanted to help clarify anything regarding the question on the herbicide program regarding the interseeding project. I know you put a lot of information in the chat, but if there's anything you need to clarify there.
Yeah, so what I added in the chat is the current recommendations that we have. I think that the only thing I would like to add is I know from one of the projects that I've collaborated with Dr. Mark Brent, who is our um, weed control for perennial crops extension professor. We're looking also into how to control annual grasses in particular in this system. And one of the things that we did notice is that sometimes it looks like the number of annual grasses it looks like there is a lot of it, but one of the things that we notice is that once we harvest that corn, the alfalfa really recovers well and can really fight back quite well against those annual grasses. So, and the reason why I bring this up is just that sometimes when we are quite used to rely on our visual estimates. But the point I'm trying to make is that even sometimes if it doesn't look that great, it doesn't mean it's not gonna work out because again, alfalfa will recover, especially after we remove that corn from the area.
Okay. And kind of along those lines, a question that was asked through the forum earlier is about the 60-inch corn rows, and maybe Harkirat can comment on that. But how do you see the short corn and the 60-inch corn working within 60-inch corn rows working within that interseeding um, system with
So,
alfalfa?
so first taking on the 60-inch corn rows. As I mentioned a little bit in my talk as well, we're already seeing some challenges with the, yield potential for short corn. So going for 60 rows would essentially mean reducing the plant populations further. So before we can actually answer some of the yield questions for that, and if is that investment worthy in terms of the gain that we're getting from alfalfa, which I am sure Martha can elaborate a little bit more on. I think that will be crucial. The problem is that we still are looking at how the canopy structures for short corn will be different from the traditional corn, and some of the research that has been done in Michigan, the preliminary observations from there actually shows that the canopy closures are actually a little bit earlier in the short corn as opposed to traditional corn. So obviously we will have to move to a little bit wider rows if we are looking at the interseeded systems. But I think coming at how can we still manage the plant populations by having wider rows is something that we need to look on. I hope I know it's not the exact answer, but
Mhm.
it's like the overall uh, observations that I have from talking to different corn agronomists around different states. So yeah.
So Marta, is there any how that interacts within the interseeding, the alfalfa? Is that something where you're going to move forward with potentially with short corn or wider rows?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question because we do know as Harkirat already mentioned that really that canopy closure of the corn is something we should be looking at, not only because of the airflow, but most certainly because of that light infiltration through the corn canopy. We want light to reach the alfalfa stand so it can grow and develop well. I would be interested to look into that. And I'll be honest, I know that this system, it's kind of novel, but also it has been looked at for a good 10, 12 years now by John Graber. This is kind of his brainchild. He came up with this idea, this system. but there has been a number of producers and researchers who have looked into a bunch of different management strategies. So I've been pondering about that. It might have been tested already. I don't know. Because it might have been done like early on as they were developing the system. But my educated guess right now is that if we allow more light into that alfalfa stand, so more light through the canopy, that would be helpful. And I don't know, Scott, if you have anything you'd like to add to this, or if you remember if that has been done before.
No, I don't have anything really extra to add there. I think, yeah, the early canopy closure is probably the biggest challenge with short corn because that canopy closure in traditional corn silage systems is generally when you start to see foliar diseases pop up, and that's where you're trying to manage that in the system. So earlier canopy closure would probably just lead to greater incidences of that foliar disease. I will say Marta mentioned in her presentation that there are current breeding efforts to select for alfalfa that's better suited to the system. And so that may open up some flexibility in the system in the future that some of the concerns around early canopy closure wouldn't be as big of a problem. And from everything that I've seen from the sort of first rounds of selection in that breeding is that they can see a significant increase in performance under that particular system through selection.
Right. Thanks for all the input on that kind of broad ranging question. But Scott, there's one specific, I think, for you in the chat. The
Yep.
680 to 750 growing degree day accumulation for first cutting seems well established. Is there any recommendation for a growing degree day accumulation target between those subsequent cuttings besides just a calendar date schedule?
Yeah. So at the moment, there's not. And it's something that I think we would really like to, I would really like to see the research community work on and look into. But the reason that it hasn't been and the challenge there, just to give a little background, is growing degree days are really useful for predicting that growth and development change when conditions aren't limiting to growth. So generally speaking, in the spring here, we're usually not limited by moisture. We usually aren't hitting temperatures so high that photosynthesis is shutting down because of stomata closure. So generally in that springtime period, growing degree days are a really good indicator of crop growth and physiological changes. As we go into the summer and we have more days where we can get hot enough that we have stomata closure, we can also have, say, water challenges. Growing degree day would start to break down in terms of that physiological response from the alfalfa plant because there's more factors than just the temperature that go into that. Again, in the fall, we're not ending up in that temperature limited phase. We are generally a little bit more moisture limited in the fall than we would be in the spring, but because the days are cooler, oftentimes that relationship is a lot more robust. And so, no, as a long-winded way of answering the question, there aren't necessarily accumulation targets in between. Though I would say if you're looking at that and you're seeing like 750 to me is a pretty good kind of lower end to shoot for. Again, it might be a little longer if you're moisture challenged. But between that 750 to 1,000 or 1,100 growing degree days seems to be kind of the general range. If you're in a dairy system, you're going to be on the lower side of that. If you're in a beef production system, you would be on the higher end of that. But something that I think certainly there's interest in working on in the larger research community. There are some folks doing some really interesting work on crop growth modeling, and some other folks at the USDA that are interested in sort of the not just growing degree days, but the quality of those days. So that would include things like moisture and total, temperature above photosynthesis range. So I think all of those things would be really interesting to give us sort of a less prescriptive approach to management throughout the season so that we can be a little bit more responsive. But for now, I think after that first cutting, using the calendar and keeping that second cutting fairly short if you're trying to go for dairy quality hay. After that, relaxing that schedule just a little bit because you're not going to lose the quality as fast in those subsequent cuttings. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
Sure. Excellent. Thanks. Thank you, Scott. As long as we've got you right now, the low lignin alfalfa, there's a question about how does that work with your prediction tool? Is there any difference in management with the tool if you're growing low lignin?
Yeah, so in terms of fall management, there wouldn't really be any appreciable differences. It's going to be very similar in terms of requirements there, because that low lignin trait isn't affecting anything to do with that photosynthetic potential or the root biomass accumulation. There may, however, be differences if you are taking advantage, if you're able to take advantage of that reduced lignin and the higher quality later into the cutting interval. If you are taking advantage of that and actually lengthening your cutting interval, so going from, say, a 28-day to a 32 or 33-day interval, you possibly are not going into that final cutting with as low root reserves as other alfalfa stands that are managed for dairy systems. So that could affect your total chances of any winter kill events. In terms of the spring management, the growing degree targets would be different. That NDF is a portion of NDF is lignin, and so there would be a decrease in NDF percentage at those growing degree day targets because of that decrease in lignin. And you would, I don't think that there's any solid data on exactly what those growing degree days are for low lignin. I certainly haven't seen it. But probably you'd be looking at that 750 to 800 growing degree day range based on what I know about the difference in lignin production and the shift in NDF target that you'd be looking at. So that's probably that 750 to 800 growing degree day for spring management of low lignin is probably the range that you're looking at to be timing your cutting. But again, it's because growing degree day isn't perfect as a model for these physiological changes without other factors included. I think that growing degree day is a really good way to time when you're going out to put in that effort for something like a scissor cut in that field to send off to the lab, make sure that you're getting the quality that you're hoping for.
And kind of along that same line, Marta, with low lignin, has that been looked at in the traffic system at all?
That's such a great question. So not yet, not yet. What I have to say, Scott already mentioned a lot about the thing with the low lignin alfalfa is that it does give you a little bit more leeway in terms of different cut intervals and how they affect nutritive value, because the reduction nutritive value is lower or slower than in other conventional alfalfa types. Now, in terms of traffic effects on alfalfa, we do know that there are some alfalfa types that have been selected, that have been bred for resistance to grazing. So the way that those selection events occur is that for various years, for a long time during the growing season, alfalfa genetic material is grazed by cattle at a very high stocking density, so a lot of animals, and it is also continuously stocked. So we're really not allowing the alfalfa any time to recover. We're really pounding that alfalfa down. So typically, those alfalfa genotypes that are well adapted to grazing, they have more protection of their growing points. That's what make them more resilient and more able to recover from grazing events. And typically what happens is that the crown is a lot lower underneath the soil. So that's what really helps protect those growing points from the impact of trampling. Now we are we're assuming that some of those characteristics that make the alfalfa more resistant to grazing will also transfer in terms of they will make the plants more also resilient to machinery traffic. So those are characteristics that we know help alfalfa withstand that traffic effect. I haven't seen anything associated with low lignin alfalfa and traffic effect. I will be very interested to look into that. The only other thing that I know, I want to mention that we are evaluating right now in a greenhouse study. We're evaluating two alfalfa types that are genetically super similar. The biggest difference is that one has the typical taproot development, and the other is a branched below ground biomass. So less of that taproot. And again, we are assuming, what we're asking ourselves is, if we don't have that big of a taproot, so we have that more branched root system, will the alfalfa recover faster or better from traffic effect? But those are, this is an experiment that is ongoing. We still have a couple of months to go, so hopefully we'll have data on that as well soon.
Okay. So one final follow-up on that, Marta. Has there been any look at how grasses would perform, like an alfalfa grass mix in a field versus just a pure stand, regarding traffic, and how that would maybe react to the overall yield or persistence of alfalfa?
Yes, I don't know. Also, I haven't seen any work on this, and we are not currently evaluating it. But just as a general rule, typically grasses have more methods to protect their growing points, and they also have more of what we call plasticity. So oftentimes grasses will just be able to withstand more traffic or trampling, because they would then, instead of having a couple of very big tillers, they will end up having a lot of little tiny tillers. And that's something that is very particular to grass species. They just tend to be more plastic. So in terms of, again, what characteristics will make a grass more resistant to traffic, for sure, grasses that have very upright growth will be more sensitive compared to those that grow a little bit closer to the ground. I would be very interested in looking at mixtures with grasses, mostly because, of course, the more different plants you have, the more mechanisms you have to kind of dodge a stress of any kind, and that includes traffic. So having a mixture just gives the ecosystem, your agroecosystem, more tools to withstand stress. And I know that Scott has some thoughts on grass alfalfa mixtures, so I'm just going to pass the ball to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, as Marta said, obviously, grasses, generally speaking, are more resistant to traffic damage than legumes would be. Um, the thing that comes to my mind, though, is in the heavy dairy systems that we have here in the state, managing alfalfa grass interseeding or alfalfa grass mixtures can be challenging from a quality perspective to get the quality that you want. That grass often needs to come off a lot sooner than the alfalfa does in the spring, or vice versa. And that can leave you with a challenge when you're trying to produce high quality dairy hay. So, but the benefits of that grass in the mixture might be very useful from a traffic avoidance perspective, or a traffic mitigation perspective. So that's sort of why the work that's happening in the greenhouse is happening, is that we're trying to partition what are the effects of traffic. Is it purely a soil compaction effect? Is it an effect on the crown? Is it an effect on the new shoots? And as we can partition out the causes of that yield decline, we can start to make some management decisions based off of that. And I think there's a real opportunity to integrate precision agriculture into fields where we often wouldn't have had precision ag before. I know a lot of people that I talk to a lot of their haying equipment, if it's just meant for hay, even if they're heavy precision ag guys, they don't necessarily have GPS on their haying equipment, because historically, what's the need of it? You can see where you mowed, you can see where the windrow is. But if we're trying to manage traffic, that precision control of our machinery could become important. And in the same regard, if we know where our machinery is going to drive beforehand, it's possible that we could use that information to do some precision planting as well, so that in the areas of the field where we know we're not going to see a tire, we could plant a solid seeded stand of alfalfa, get the highest productivity out of that. And then the areas where we know we're going to have heavy traffic, so say some field roads that we've established to get semi trucks into the field, we might establish some of those alfalfa grass mixtures to give a little bit more resiliency in those spaces. And across the whole field, you would have an easier time of managing for that quality versus a whole field being that mixture. So those are kind of my thoughts on where things might go in the future as we get a lot more information on the effects of traffic and can partition out the different effects of traffic on alfalfa yield and persistence.
All right, thank you, Scott. I think we got a few seconds left before lunch here. So Harkirat, I just want to ask real quick, you do the link for the performance trial, hybrid performance trials is in the chat box. Is there anything you want to new that we could look for in there? Or how was that just came out recently, correct?
Yeah, it came out, I think a week before Thanksgiving. And unfortunately, because we are trying the new web page, the visibility was a little bit of an issue. So I'm trying to push it as much as possible through these update meetings. I would say most of the template that we followed this year is very consistent with what it was throughout these years, because I didn't want to change anything drastically at a very short notice. But going into next year, we are looking forward to a much more detailed growing season analysis, and also maybe some from some updates from the other faculty members in the department and across the other departments, which can actually inform some decisions for planting corn. But currently, yeah, that's, I mean, there's like, I would say there is new information, but there is there is not anything extra,
Gotcha.
at least this year. Yeah,
Understood.
I'm
Yep.
sorry for that.
Yeah, no, great. Glad it's out there. And again, we look forward to your research in the future. So again, thank you, Harkirat, Scott, Marta, again, for helping out with the update meeting this morning.